Chapter 2, Children's Stories, begins with a poem. I would scream, but there's no voice left. I would cry, but there are no tears left. I would fight, but there's no strength left. Poem by Natalie, 13, Victim. Subchapter Nottingham, Thursday, 21 January 1988, 9:30 a.m. In the lounge of his suburban home, a 3-year-old boy was playing. Joan, his foster mother, noticed something strange about the movements. What are you doing, Mark? And there's a footnote here. The names of everyone mentioned in this book have been changed unless the contrary is specifically indicated by the inclusion of a surname. What are you doing, Mark? Witches? Will you tell me about it? Mark nodded. You have to get in the middle of a ring and then they laugh at you. Who laughs at you? Daddy Kieran, Wayne, Michelle, Glenda, Steve, Diana, Granddad, and some others come, more witches. Carla, who is one of Mark's cousins, have to touch all those willies. Then you get the baby and put it on the floor. They all go, ha, and put their arms up and walk around him. Is it a baby boy? Yes. How do you know? Him got his clothes off. We see him willy. Daddy Kieran and Wayne jump on it like this. Mark puts his teddy on the floor and jumps on it, shouting, ha! Them makes us in the garden and whip us, then locks us up in the garage. What happens to the baby they've jumped on? They put in the garages so you can't see it smashed. They paint themselves on the face. They paint them willies. These words were spoken by a boy just beginning to feel safe after more than 3 years of constant mental, physical, and sexual abuse. They form part of a transcript of his disclosures recorded on tape by his foster mother for almost 2 years. Halfway through those disclosures, unprompted and evidently nervous, Mark began talking about witch parties, where several adult men and women abused him, his brother and their cousins, in the course of bizarre rituals. He, of course, never used the word ritual. Indeed, when he had been placed with his foster parents in December 1986, he had known only a few childish words, most centered on his genitals or bodily functions. Almost as soon as he arrived at his foster mother's home, Mark had told Joan about the abuse he had endured all his short life. Quote, he was continually talking about his willy being pulled or being hurt or adults putting their willies up his bottom. Day after day, he would talk about things like that. It wasn't just a one-off experience with him. You could tell it had happened on numerous occasions, close quote. Mark also exhibited a classic behavioral symptom of the abused child. He was unduly fascinated by other children's bottoms and genitalia and made several disturbing attempts to play with them. Psychiatrists describe actions like this as learned behavior. Put simply, Mark was merely doing what he had seen and felt his parents do to him. His younger brother, Dean, also showed signs of both sexual abuse and severe neglect. By the time he was 18 months old, he was eating feces, even seeking it out in other children's potties at the playgroup he attended. But gradually, as Mark and Dean grew more settled at home with Joan, the nature of their disclosures changed. Joan had already discussed with Nottingham's specially signed social team the alarming number of burns and deliberate injuries both boys had suffered, apparently at the hands of their parents. By March 1987, Mark had corrected that impression. The burns, he said, were caused by an iron wielded not by his father, but by another adult who he said was Dean's daddy. He also talked about a big mister, tall and wearing glasses, who abused him. The big mister got into bed with him and put his tinkle in my mouth. Mark didn't disclose this part easily. Joan noted an intense fear when he described the big mister. She also found that Mark had toilet problems. He appeared reluctant to let his movements go and tensed up whenever Joan attempted to wipe his bottom. As spring turned to summer and then to autumn, Mark gained more confidence in Joan and felt more secure. Unprompted, he told her about other adults abusing him and other children who had been abused. Joan kept the social workers constantly up to date with the latest information. In turn, Nottingham Social Services liaised with the local police, and the first steps in preparing a criminal case against the abusers were taken. Then, in late winter 1987, Mark dropped his bombshell. He, Dean, and their cousins Carla, Tracy, and Nancy had been abused at parties, some in other people's houses, where adults dressed up as witches enchanted. It quickly became clear to Joan that this abuse was different from anything she had ever come across before. Although she had never heard of ritual or satanic abuse, she understood that Mark was trying to tell her about some form of occult ceremonies in which very young children were sexually abused, tortured, and even killed. And even at home with Joan, Mark didn't feel entirely safe about disclosing what he had experienced. Quote, "Them witches pull Dean's hair. You have to take all your clothes off. Then they look at your willy, all the kids. Then they feel them bottom." Who does? The witches. Do you know these witches? Some, not all of them. Who are they? Daddy Kieran, Wayne, Diana, Granddad, Steve, Mummy, Michelle, and some more, but I can't remember them. Mum bleeds. Whose bum? Tracy's, Carla, and baby Nancy. Diana has to wipe the blood away with a tissue. We at the monster's house at the party. Close quote. Despite her apprehension, Joan managed to avoid prompting Mark with leading questions or pressing him to disclose against his will. Piece by piece, the details emerged, starting with a special drink the children had all been given at the parties. In an extended family where many of the youngsters had been neglected to the extent that they were reduced to drinking water scooped from the toilet bowl with a shoe, such preparation had to have a point. It did. The drink contained something to make the children drowsy. Quote, "We have lots and lots of drink, orange and red stuff. Sometimes it's nice like orange. Sometimes it's nasty, makes us sick. Tracy and Carla's sick. Dean's sick. Them laugh at us when we sick. Who does? You're sick round the bonfire. They look after my baby." Why? Does everyone have a baby? Yes, you do. You walk around the bonfire saying, "Witchy, witchy, witchy." The witch makes us go into the fire. It burns us. Have you got shoes on? Yes. Do the witches have shoes on? No. When they splash you with water, you're stronger and stronger. The witches splash you with water. Then what happens when they splash you with water? You be hot on your back. I don't want to go to those parties anymore. You're safe with me now. You won't have to. Me not say any more now. Them kids all get belted. Close quote. But Mark evidently needed to tell Joan about his abuse, returning again and again to the subject of witch parties. Although Joan was struggling to understand what it all meant, she was in no doubt that the boy was sincere. Quote, "I believed him straight away because of the fear I'd seen within him, and the fear that I'd noticed just being around generally with him if anything upset him or somebody was dressed up. There was a big fear there with him." Close quote. At 11 a.m. on Thursday, 21 January, Mark again returned to the subject. "Mum know them witches, have them sheep." What? Ba black sheep. Have you any wool sheep? Yes, them kill them sheep with the fingernails around the neck. Where does the sheep come from? A witch brings it in a car in a plastic box. What kind of car? A black one. The sheep bleeds. Where from? From its bottom and around its neck. Mark runs his finger around his neck as if he's cutting his throat. Is it a big sheep or a little one? It's big. Them get spiders and worms in black boxes. We touch them, we eat them. They put worms in our hair. What do they do that for? Them witches go magic, 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 and make you go sleep. Them witches make Damien, another cousin, wobble and go to sleep. Anything else, Mark? No, no, don't want to now. Close quote. All the recordings of Mark's disclosures were passed on to Team 4 of Nottinghamshire Social Services Department, a hand-picked team of therapists all experienced in child sexual abuse cases. Christine Johnson, the senior worker, saw quickly that the boys' disclosures were pointing at something beyond simple sexual abuse. Quote, as well as all the common behavioral problems you would expect from a child who had been sexually abused, he was showing an excessive amount of fear, particularly of toilets, spiders, blood, monsters, and what he calls witches. I suppose some of these fears are not unusual to some degree in children of his age, but what we were seeing was not normal degree. This was panic, phobic responses to everyday situations. He was once absolutely terrified when he was given a hot dog to eat. It took a while for us to realize that after what he had been through, he took the words quite literally. Close quote. Although Mark and Dean had been taken into care and fostered by Joan, their parents initially had regular access visits. By the end of January 1988, Joan realized that pressure was being put on Mark not to disclose details of the rituals he had experienced. Since the previous December, he had given explicit details of gross sexual abuse by both parents, his uncles, aunts, his grandfather, and mysterious strangers. He had also told Joan, and indirectly social services, that these same adults were also abusing his several cousins and a number of children from outside the extended family. On 27 January, Mark's father had seen him on a formal access visit. The effect was immediate. Daddy say me can't talk to you. Why daddy say you can't talk to me? 'Cause him hit me. Daddy say not speak to you and Jane, Mark's social worker, anymore. Policeman get me. I stopping with you. When did daddy tell you not to speak to me? Yesterday. Him said don't talk to you or can't sit on your knee anymore. I can, can't I? I love you. The reason for his father's attempt to silence Mark was becoming self-evident, and it was not the fear of detection for sexual abuse alone, since that had been out in the open for more than a year. It was the details of the witch parties that Mark was repeatedly disclosing to Joan, identical each time, however long had passed since the previous disclosure, which were making the adults nervous. Each recorded session brought forward new evidence of a well-organized and highly ritualized abuse involving a bewildering variety of serious crimes and a growing list of victims. Simultaneously, Mark's cousins were making matching allegations entirely independently. Their disclosures contained precise details of the same bizarre abuse, strangers and family members dressed up in robes, dancing in a circle around a group of dazed, possibly drugged children. Sadistic abuse, frequently involving cutting, blood, urine and feces consumption, penetration of the vaginas or anuses with spiders and snakes, being burned in the ground in covered boxes, the slaughter of animals and of babies. Nor were the children simply disclosing the details verbally. From their earliest days in care, all the children had been given crayons and paper. Their therapists had encouraged them to draw, knowing that this is one of the most reliable and safe ways for children to reveal what has been done to them. According to Judith Dawson, Nottinghamshire's child abuse consultant, who headed Team 4, this seemingly simple therapy was, in fact, carefully controlled and monitored. Quote, it was a way for these very young children to explain to us what had happened, but we were very careful to prevent them from discussing or agreeing the content between themselves. All the children were in separate foster homes and contact was minimal. I was satisfied that the drawings came independently, and as they did, and the mass of drawings grew, each confirmed the other. but it was the sheer detail of the abuse contained in them that was particularly convincing. The technique was that the child would draw the picture and tell the foster mother what was happening within it. She would then write those words on the side. In a typical example, a 4-year-old drew something that both represented an ordinary type of sexual abuse and yet was different. When the foster mom asked what the picture referred to, the answer was, "Witches at the witch party." He pointed out the mask that his mother wore, a belly button and someone's penis. It was obvious that these pictures weren't some kind of symbolic drawings. The detail was too great for that. Equally, it would be the case that the children would describe an incident verbally and then some weeks later draw it precisely. We were forced to the conclusion that these children had in some way experienced what they were telling and drawing, and that the only explanation which fitted was what we came to understand as satanic or ritual abuse, close quote. One picture Mark drew early on sticks in Judith Dawson's mind. It showed a small boy fastened to a cross with pins through his hands and feet. The caption he dictated to his foster mother read, "I was a naughty Jesus." It was a self-portrait. Spread out across Nottingham and their foster homes, the children independently built up a convincing picture of a well-organized group of adults repeatedly abusing and apparently killing babies and young children during ceremonies. Joy, another of the foster mothers, recorded what one small girl told her over a 2-year period. Quote, "She told us about groups of people dancing around in witches' costumes, abusing her, and about drinking blood. She used to say little bits, then those little bits would get a bit longer. And so it went on until eventually she came out with a long disclosure of something that had happened to her. She just went through the whole lot, and it pieced together all the other bits which she had said. She had to be reliving in her mind what had actually happened to her. She couldn't have made up in detail a whole story like that," close quote. Although none of Team 4, much less the foster parents, had heard of ritual abuse or the clinical surveys undertaken by Pamela Hudson, the disclosures in Nottingham matched those from California and the rest of America, bizarre allegation for bizarre allegation. All the surveyed U.S. cases included allegations by child victims of abusers in robes, wearing masks, and carrying candles. The Nottingham children described and drew exactly the same. Every American child in the study claimed that the abuse had at some point been filmed. Mark and his cousins were adamant that they had been photographed by cameras with lights on, and that they had watched films of their own abuse on television. They also claimed abuse by strangers, torture, and threats to discourage disclosure, all of which corresponds 100% with Hudson's survey. Each of another 8 categories: children defecated on, forced to eat body wastes, witnessing animal torture and killing, being taken to churches for abuse, being locked in cages or boxes, the use of drugs, abuse on crosses, and the sacrifice and consumption of small babies were independently identified by several of the Nottingham children. There were other indicators which Hudson and other American experts would have recognized. The children's unshakable belief in aspects of the abuse which could not possibly have been true. A live shark at one of the parties was a recurring feature of the Nottingham disclosures. Similarly, the allegation that rich and powerful men with luxurious houses were in charge. Adults frequently identified by children throughout the United States as Mr. Pooh or other childish words for excrement. A diary of disclosures recorded by one of the Nottingham children in 1989 could have been a replica of those taken 3,000 miles away. Wednesday, 17 May 1989, quote, "When Mr. Pooh Pants goes to the witch parties, well, he's horrible. Why? 'Cause he's the boss. We have to call him High Man. Do you? Yes, Mr. Brown, a colored adult male identified by several children, Because they say, children, come here. Children, come here. What do you mean? Well, Mr. Poopants says to me, number one, come here. We have numbers, but Mr. Poopants and Mr. Brown don't have numbers. Close quote. One of the children fostered by Joy gave detailed descriptions of the luxurious houses used during the rituals. Quote, she talked about a house with a big swimming pool and cameras and four-poster beds. Well, these children came off a very poor council estate. Kids like that, I doubt would even know what a four-poster bed was. But she saw it in one of my catalogs and she pointed it out. She said, that's like the bed we had to lie on in this dark room with cameras, and they took photographs. By the middle of 1989, the Nottingham children had given the most detailed description of ritual abuse ever heard in Britain. In most cases, and with no opportunity for any cross-fertilization of evidence, these deprived youngsters had confirmed each other's stories of ceremonies involving dozens of adults and children. After some initial reluctance, Team 4 was convinced and began seeking out guidance on how best to help the children. Judith Dawson saw no alternative. Quote, we repeatedly looked at the possibility that these children were using some sort of symbolic language to describe what they had been through. It could have been, for example, that when they talked about snakes, these were a symbol for the penises that had really been there. But the children would draw a snake, which they said was inserted in their bottom, and they would draw a penis. They knew the difference. The more we listened, the more we saw the terror, the trances, and heard about the rituals they described. It became clear that these kids had been born into a world where good had to be destroyed and innocence perverted. The only explanation for all they told us was satanic ritual abuse. After all, you tell me how else can a 4-year-old boy who could barely speak when he came into our care suddenly recite word perfect the opening words of an historic satanic chant in Latin, close quote. In 1989, 10 adult members of the family were jailed for a combined total of more than 150 years. But the evidence from the children, and corroborated by adult witnesses, of ritual abuse was never pursued. As we shall see in Chapter 7, what started as a textbook example of how to handle such cases degenerated into a shoddy and shameful farce. South London, 12 August 1988. In the lounge of her small council house, Janie was trying to get 2 small children into bed and stop her baby grizzling. She looked for the bottle of gripe water and found it had been spilled. Furious, she rounded on Laura, age 3, and Bobby, age 2. From the guilty looks on their faces, she knew that they had spilled the liquid, but neither would own up. Quote, I remembered something my mother used to say to me when as a child I told her lies, and I said to the kids I was going to bring the lying man who had a long nose which could smell out who was telling fibs. Suddenly, Laura went absolutely hysterical. I'd never seen anything like it. I realized something was seriously wrong, and I took her upstairs to calm her down. Eventually, she said she was sorry she had told lies, but that her daddy had said she must not tell me the truth. I started digging away at what exactly he had said, and the whole story started to tumble out. Close quote. Janie's husband had been jailed 3 months earlier for assaulting her, blacking her eyes and kicking her in the stomach at a time when she was 7 months pregnant. Now Janie discovered her children were terrified and scarred by what he had done to them. Quote, my kids were subjected to all kinds of sexual abuse, everything you can think of, and several things you could never dream about in your worst nightmares. They saw bestiality, group lesbianism, and homosexuality, torture, murder, and what I can only call deliberate blasphemy. Laura started by telling me that Daddy and another woman used to take them to the park and that she and Bobby watched as they had sex. Then other stories came out. I didn't force her to tell me about times when they were taken to parks and people's houses with other adults and children and were filmed being abused. The boys would be separated into one group and the girls into another, and they would be abused individually within a circle drawn on the ground. Laura said the adults would give them a white powder off a spoon, and that made her feel like she wanted to run about out of control. The abuse they were put through seemed incredibly sadistic. Bobby told me how he had been tied on an upside down cross and a crucifix pushed up his bottom. Laura said the same thing had been done to her with real live snakes. Animals were involved too. They both told me separately about going to a park with a zoo in it when the zoo was closed for Christmas. But the animals were there, and they said that these adults had stood around chanting while Daddy had sex with a goat and the woman he was with, they were told to call her Mummy, had sex with a donkey. I asked them, what was it all about? And they said that Daddy had told them he was Jesus and the woman was Mary, and that this is what Christmas really meant, close quote. At 35, Janie, with 2 failed marriages and a brief spell in prison for drug possession behind her, was far from naive. She knew that men abused children and frequently terrified them with threats. But the stories her children disclosed, painfully at first, were beyond anything she had ever imagined. Quote, I thought I was going mad. I kept asking myself how it could have happened after all the kids were living with me at the time and their dad was living here too. Then I remembered the times I'd let him take them out alone because I was so tired with looking after them all the time and with the baby inside me. I can remember the kids coming back covered in bruises and running about like mad things. They wouldn't go to bed. They couldn't. Their dad said they had been fighting. I just thought the wildness was overexcitement. I think now it could have been the effect of the drugs. Laura used to say to me, I'm speeding, I'm speeding. The fear in them was something else. They were completely terrified of ordinary kids' things. Cartoon characters that children normally love would send them hysterical. I couldn't understand it until Bobby told me that one of the men who abused them had Bugs Bunny tattooed on his arm. They were also petrified of getting old, of any of us getting old. This was because of what they had seen, what they had been made to do to several old tramps. They called it shopping for people. They would go out with the adults and find a vagrant. It didn't matter if it was a man or a woman. Then, when they got them back to wherever this meeting was happening, they all had to punch the tramp until his face went black. Then one of the group would cut the tramp's throat and catch all the blood in a big jar. Someone would daub this blood on the children's bottoms and they would be abused. They would also be made to eat the flesh of the old people. They saw the bodies being burned in big ovens and the bones ground up into powder. After that, they were made to dance around a fire, sometimes to jump through it and chant. One day, Laura told me she was made to say a prayer. She recited it for me. It started, O Lord, Prince of Darkness. Laura's only 3. How could she have made all this up? Close quote. Janie took her children to her local social services department in August of 1988. They quickly arranged for a medical examination, even though neither Laura nor Bobby had attended a ceremony since their father was sent to prison several months earlier. The pediatrician examined Laura's vagina and anus and found evidence compatible with, but not conclusive of, sexual abuse. Bobby, too, was examined. Here there was less doubt. There was, quote, evidence compatible with penile penetration of the anus, close quote. Both children were listed as victims of sexual abuse and their names entered on the at-risk register. Both had given detailed descriptions and in some cases named their abusers. Janie promised them that this would be enough to put these people in prison, but the children's ages and, more disturbingly, the precise details of the bizarre rituals they had undergone put paid to that. Some social workers believed the children's stories. Bobby particularly made an impression on one social worker. He explained that he had been tied upside down in front of a group of men while a crucifix was pushed into his bottom concluded gently, quote, "That's not very nice, is it?" Close quote. By February 1989, Laura and Bobby were disclosing more and more detail to Janie about the rituals they had been put through. In turn, Janie searched for anyone who could explain what the stories meant. She looked in vain. One ceremony in particular puzzled her. Quote, "Laura says there was a small man called the Leopard Man present, and that sometimes she was put in a box. The box was put in the ground and the lid was closed on her. There were other kids there as well, and this happened to them. They all screamed and cried for their mummies. After a while, Laura said the box was opened by one of the adults who said, 'Your mummy didn't come, but I did. Hate your mummy.' It doesn't make any sense. Who could get pleasure out of frightening a child like that? The only thing I can think is that it was part of some sort of brainwashing of the children. I've told the police, but they aren't going to investigate what the kids say any further." Close quote. It was, as we shall see in chapter 6, the children's detailed descriptions of such ceremonies which persuaded the detectives not to take them seriously. One dismissed Laura and Bobby's tortured and tearful disclosures as a fabrication. West Midlands, 12 June 1988. In a modern townhouse in one of the West Midlands' more pleasant suburbs, Julia answered the phone. The call was from a childminder to say that Julia's 4-year-old daughter, Rachel, had confided details of what might be sexual abuse. Within an hour, Rachel was being examined by a doctor. He found evidence of inflammation of the girl's vaginal passage, but not enough for a clear diagnosis. He told Julia to come back if there was hard evidence of cuts, bruising, or abrasion. 2 weeks later, Julia was handed a report on Rachel from the playgroup she attended part-time. The document stated baldly that the little girl had fondled a boy sexually and pushed her tongue in his mouth when she kissed him. The report also noted that Rachel had appeared withdrawn at playgroup for more than a year. By August, Rachel disclosed to a police officer that her father had hurt her vagina and her legs, and that he had taken her into his bed to abuse her. It was the first formal confirmation of what Julia had suspected for several weeks. She and her husband were separated pending a divorce. Immediately, she tried to stop the excess visits, but Rachel's disclosures were not enough to prove abuse, much less to pin the blame on her father. Independently, Rachel's older brother began, cautiously at first, to tell Julia that his father had abused him too. Timmy was 6. His quite separate confirmation of what Rachel disclosed should have been enough to set formal child abuse procedure in motion. It wasn't. The social services department refused to act because there was no conclusive medical evidence. An anal examination of Timmy proved negative. But that was far from surprising. His father had not had access for some months. The police confronted Julia's husband with his children's allegations. He denied them, and the case collapsed. With no backup from trained therapists, all future disclosure work would be left entirely to Julia. It was to prove a costly mistake. From the beginning, Julia had to confront her children's terror. At the same time, she was told by social services to treat them as normal children. Quote, "I found that no help whatsoever. I did try to treat them as normally as possible, but their experience of life hasn't been normal. How do you treat as normal a daughter who curls up and sobs hysterically when the entertainer at her birthday party plays Mr. Wolf and chases the children? What is normal about a child going absolutely rigid, a small ball of fear because this man is playing at chasing her?" I began holding Rachel 2 or 3 times a week, as I'd seen therapists doing holding treatment with autistic children. Eventually, after she had cried out her fears, we had a week in which she really began, quite willingly, to show me what her father had done to her using dollies. Over 3 days, she made remarkable progress from being withdrawn and unable to look me in the eye to outgoing, cheerful chatter, volunteering information about her abuse to an astonishing degree. Close quote. At that point, Julia thought she was dealing with a case of ordinary sexual abuse, horrifying enough, but nothing like the detailed disclosures of the obscene rituals her son and daughter were about to give. By February 1989, Timmy in particular had described a ring of multiple abusers who had threatened both children with knives, physically assaulted them, and taken them into dark cellars for yet more abuse. By March, the picture was suddenly clearer. Unprompted, Julia recorded every disclosure session on tape to protect herself. The children described what were clearly rituals, using, like Team 4 in Nottingham, paper and crayons as a means of drawing out the poison of their experiences. Julia built up a disturbing archive detailing a child's view of ritual abuse. One of Timmy's drawings showed a small boy in a cage with thick bars. Julia wrote her son's explanation on the top of the sheet. Quote, "They had very thick, straight bars on the cages, and if you touched them, they would electrocute you. They put me and Rachel in the cages, and when they took us out, they hurt us by pulling our legs, putting our arms up and throwing slime at us. They sweared at us, pulling my willy and her vagina, and putting their willies up our bums, ears, and mouths. Rachel shouted, 'Help me, somebody, please help me.'" Close quote. A further drawing showed a man disguised as an animal with a spotted skin. Once again, Julia recorded Timmy's explanation. Quote, "At the hurting club," the name he had given his group of abusers, "they hurt children, smack them on the face, kill children, swear at people, they punch them up the min and willy. Men and ladies have snake masks to wear, and my father makes them by poo-poo and wee-wee. He puts pooey paper in the oven, and when it's dry, he takes shapes of snakes and decorates them with poo. Leopard man caught a disease eating poo and wee. He kills children and does naughty dances when his willy goes hard, and wee and poo shoot out." Close quote. Other pictures showed a child being burned on a cross, an animal being killed on a table with a knife held by Timmy's father, and a child strapped to a table with an adult weeing up her min. Close quote. Each of the allegations matched those made in Nottingham by Mark and his cousins, the disclosures of Laura and Bobby in South London, and the list of key indicators compiled by Pamela Hudson in her 1988 American survey. Yet none of the mothers or social workers, much less the children, knew each other. Independently, dozens of very young children were making identical and detailed allegations of bizarre abuse and torture. One picture Timmy drew that spring could have been the work of any one of the other victims. In it, there are 3 children. Their faces are very sad, one is crying, but their bodies are not whole. Each child is cut into pieces which straggle across the bottom of the page. Julia's transcription of Timmy's explanation reads, quote, "They cut some boy's head off and weed up his bum and swear at him and did a clothes off dance. Their clothes shoot off and their mins and boobs shoot out." Julia noted in her diary, "It sounded like he had taken drugs or was hallucinating." They chopped their boobs off and put them up children's and grown-ups' ears. They did naughty dances at horrible parties. They cut children up and they hung them on hooks and punched them in the faces as punching bags and up the willies and mins. And they did it to the men and ladies, and they punched them up the willies and boobs. They cut the children up in pieces, and when they went out, they left the jigsaw of children in a mess, and it made blood marks all over the carpet. Close quote. Julia is a caring mother and an intelligent woman. She teaches night school classes and has a formal education training. She knew her children had never seen horror videos, at least not unless their father had shown them during access visits. She also doubted, quite accurately, that any horror film could show the precise details her children were disclosing. But by the middle of 1989, she was desperate for information, which might make sense of what her children had been telling her for several months. It seemed to be consistent with ritual abuse. A friend advised her to contact an evangelical group, which had been set up to campaign against the occult. In doing so, she effectively closed the door on any official help. Uda Pekela, Holland, May 1987. Dr. Fred Jonkers was baffled. The 4-year-old boy in front of him was disclosing sexual abuse of a type and degree he had never experienced before. Uda Pekela is a small village of around 8,000 people, close to the German border in the northeastern tip of Holland. Jonkers and his wife had come to the village 10 years before as doctors in the community healthcare center. In May 1987, neither had heard of ritual abuse or the clinical assessment underway in the United States. But as GPs, their duties included diagnosing sexual abuse, and when the 4-year-old boy's mother brought him to the practice suffering from anal bleeding, Yonkers' suspicions were aroused. Very quickly, the boy confirmed the diagnosis. He disclosed abuse at the hands of adults who poked sticks up his rectum. He also identified another boy who had been abused. Quote, very soon it became clear to us that this was not just one more incident of child sexual abuse. The very first week of police investigations into the matter resulted in a list of the names of 25 children, presumably the victims of sexual abuse. This quick result was mainly due to the fact that during the course of the interviews, the children mentioned the names of other involved children. The children's statements were corresponding, often in detail. The children were of the ages 3 to 6. During the following weeks, more cases came to light, this time mainly concerning older children up to the age of 12. Close quote. The police investigations, managed by Dutch Justice Department, proved to be less than rigorous. Only one detective had any real experience of interviewing child witnesses, and psychiatric experts were not brought in until many weeks after the investigation began to founder. The children's disclosures were too bizarre for the professionals, including initially the Jonkers, to believe, quote, we were not aware of satanic rituals during the initial stages. We heard so many things from the children that we could not understand that we ascribed them to the children's fantasies, close quote. Had Jonkers and the team of investigating detectives known anything about ritual abuse in May 1987, they would quickly have spotted striking similarities between the disclosures of young children in Uda Pekela and those in Britain and America. Not all of the 90 children identified as probable victims of child sexual abuse in the small Dutch village disclosed indicators of ritual abuse, but there were, as in Pamela Hudson's initial Mendocino County survey, enough independently corroborating stories to discern a disturbing pattern. The children's stories. It all probably started in the autumn of 1986 and reached its peak during the Easter vacation in the month of April 1987. Children of both sexes and of the ages 3 to 12 were coaxed or forced to go along to various buildings in the area by themselves or in groups. Sometimes games were then played, often resulting in sexual activities. The smaller children were usually kept together in groups, while the older children were also singly abused. There was no question of the children knowing each other. They were all from different schools. They were often brought to the buildings under the influence of drugs, which were put into candy, lemonade, and ice cream, or in the form of pills or injections. They spoke of watching a video, of seeing their friends being abused on the screen. Parties were held at which there were carnival costumes, and the children were given little flags. Then came the instructions to undress. The children spoke of having to sit naked on the floor, or of being forced to lick the genitals and breasts of the grown-ups, or having to walk around in circles with little leather belts tied around their penises. They also spoke of having to swim in swimming pools, of their heads being pushed underwater, of having to wash each other with colored shampoo, and of rubbing paint on each other, rainbow colors on the cheeks. They spoke of being rubbed with feces, of being urinated upon, even over their faces, of being forced to remove the feces out of the anus of a grown-up, of being forced to eat it and to drink urine. Close quote. Disclosure by disclosure, the Jonkers were coming face to face with terror. The child victims of Uda Pekela were no different from those in America or throughout Britain. Whatever the motive or the ordeal they had been put through, the result was overwhelming fear. The Dutch children also claimed that animals had been involved. The young ones were convinced that bears, lions, and crocodiles were present during the carnivals. This curious aspect, an unshakable belief in something that could not have genuinely happened, was to be echoed in what the very young children in Nottingham disclosed later that year. In Nottingham, the children were scared by sharks. In Uda Pekela, the same technique was used, but there it was lions, bears, and crocodiles. That it was a technique became clear from the disclosures of the older children in the village. They too had seen these creatures during their abuse, but they had noticed the zips. They knew there were adults inside those animal suits. It did not make the carnivals any less scary. As spring turned to summer, Dr. Jonkers was hearing stories of ever greater suffering from the children. Quote, notable were things like being beaten with belts which had hooks on them, of being punched in the stomach. They also spoke of being tied to poles and of knives being thrown at them, of stonings, of being locked up in closets or cages. Dogs were set loose on them, which were then wolves. They also disclosed even more bizarre events of being in a church and having to lie down on a table naked. Eventually, it became clear to us that the table was meant as an altar. The children went on to tell us of the presence of babies strapped up in cradles, of having to cut the babies loose and having to carve a cross on the babies' backs. There was also a dead baby put away in a plastic bag. Close quote. Like Team 4 in Nottingham, Dr. Jonkers tried to suggest to the children that they had actually not seen what they thought they had. Couldn't the baby have been a doll? The children shook their heads. Had the doctor ever seen a doll crawl or cry? Jonkers progressed carefully. By now, the Justice Department had begun to ridicule the entire notion that the Uda Pekela children had been even sexually, let alone ritually, abused. There was a certain amount of medical evidence which could have corroborated the stories, but it was not entirely conclusive because several months were allowed to pass between the alleged assaults and medical examinations. Patiently, the Jonkers analyzed the patterns emerging from the children's disclosures of bizarre rituals. Quote, let us be clear, not all the children spoke about these experiences, but a number disclosed them on various occasions. They also spoke of cigarettes being put out on their skins and of superficial knife wounds. They told us they couldn't always understand the grown-ups very well. The grown-ups spoke a queer-sounding language. They weren't allowed to talk about their experience at home, otherwise their parents would be killed or their house set on fire. Or the grown-ups would do the same as what they had done to a kitten, which, before the eyes of the children, had been killed with a circular saw, close quote. Nonetheless, some of the children did talk, and what they disclosed was entirely compatible with cases of satanic ritual abuse. Mummy, one of the victims, said in June, quote, do you know what the name of the leader of the abusers is? He's called the Master, close quote. The disclosures fitted the classic ritual pattern. Every key indicator defined by Pamela Hudson was there, from child pornography to murder. Quote, at the end of 1987, a number of children told the following story for the first time. They spoke of a brown-colored and deformed female child, about 6 years old. A yellow cross was placed on her chest. Subsequently, the child's chest was cut open, and something reddish-brown was taken out and placed in a little box. The older children spoke of a series of such events, not only concerning the little girl, but also concerning white babies and animals. There had also been an elderly couple who hadn't looked European. All these events took place in a dark shed with lighted candles. The children were forced to assist with the killings by beating the victims with shovels. They had to wear long white robes on these occasions, close quote. Bizarre as the disclosures were, Jonkers might never have attempted to match them with the indicators of ritual abuse had he not received anonymous phone calls throughout the period of the investigation, allegedly from former victims, identifying the abuse as part of a series of satanic rituals. At the time, Jonkers knew nothing about ritual abuse. By the time he had researched the phenomenon, it was largely too late. As with the cases in America and Britain, the disclosures had been written off as fantasy. We shall consider this trend in detail in Chapter 6. Hamilton, Ontario, February 1985. Two young sisters, Erica, age 7, and Jenny, age 4, were being driven through the streets of Hamilton, Wentworth. It was late in the evening and their mother was desperate. She was looking for the local offices of the Children's Aid Society, the official organization mandated by the state government of Ontario as its child protection agency. CAS's authority was established by statute in 1985 and its credibility was extremely high. Later that night, CAS admitted Erica and Jenny to its temporary care, and the children were placed with a tried and trusted foster mother. Their real mother knew and indeed had requested this intervention. She had called CAS's emergency after-hour service, saying she could no longer cope and feared she might physically harm the children. That night was the first step in what would become Canada's longest ever child custody case. The route would ultimately lead to an historic judgment in the Unified Family Court of Hamilton Wentworth. On 30 March 1987, ritual abuse was judicially recognized in Canada. But the process leading to that landmark decision was severely damaging for every person involved in the case. The children's interests were submerged in the growling legal battle, and their parents' urgent need for therapy was ignored. Above all, the relationship between the police and the CAS, hitherto strong and effective, crumbled into acrimony. The cause was the children's disclosure of ritual abuse. In Hamilton, as throughout the world, children's stories of satanic abuse split both agencies and communities down the middle. Ontario in 1985, Uda Pekela in 1987, and Nottingham in 1988. The pattern was identical. Growing up for Erica and Jenny had not been a happy experience. Their mother had been severely abused, sexually, physically, and emotionally, for much of her childhood. She was, by her own admission, almost certainly suffering from multiple personality disorder and prone to terrifying bouts of aggression towards her daughters. Despite this, Erica and Jenny loved their mother and wanted to be reunited with her one day. Still, they were glad of the conditions in their new home that night in February 1985. They had lived until then in a flat on the 20th floor of an apartment block. The rooms were filthy and infested with cockroaches. Their school clothes were dirty and uncared for. Both Erica and Jenny were constantly hungry, and their mother left them with a series of unsuitable babysitters. The worst was their uncle, who already had a lengthy history of sexually abusing children. Both girls were in emotional turmoil, deprived of love and suffering hurt and rejection. Their father did not live with them in the flat, but their mother had a boyfriend. Erica and Jenny liked him better than their real father. Not much, but at least they weren't quite so terrified of him. Their mother and her boyfriend had hurt them badly, but they were the only adults Erica and Jenny really knew. That night in February, they just wanted the hurt to be over and to go back home. Nancy McGillivray and Nora Dugan were, respectively, supervisor and director of services at CAS in Hamilton. The case of Erica and Jenny was to cause them the worst trauma they had experienced in their working lives. Quote, shortly after placement, the children began to disclose to their foster mother that at the hands of their parents and boyfriend of their mothers. They had been sexually and physically abused and forced to participate in pornographic movies, ritualistic killings, and acts of bestiality and cannibalism. These disclosures were subsequently repeated over the next few months to a barrage of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and police officers. The evidence of sexual abuse included allegations by the children that their mother had performed cunnilingus on both of them and performed it on each other. Also, the mother's boyfriend had forced the girls to perform fellatio on him. The children were forced to eat peanut butter and jelly, jam, out of their mother's vagina and from their mother's boyfriend's penis. Their mother had also put Vaseline on a banana and pushed it into the anus of one of the children. Finally, birds and feathers had been forced into the children's vaginas. This sexual torture, coupled with the history of physical, emotional deprivation Erica and Jenny had endured, persuaded the CAS social workers to make out a strong case to change the girls' care order from voluntary to compulsory. Once they felt safe in their new home, the girls' disclosures grew ever more disturbing. They said they had been taken to graveyards and witnessed rituals in which their mother and her boyfriend first murdered, then mutilated, and ate the flesh of adults and children. Nor did the ceremonies end there. Erica and Jenny first told their foster mother, then the lengthy queue of child abuse experts, that the grown-up had continued with an orgy involving the children, their mother, the boyfriend, and the recently dismembered bodies. Parts of the corpses, they said, were placed inside their own vaginas. They also disclosed this, whether for the first time or later on, in the 20 hours of audio recorded and 25 further video recorded sessions with therapists. The girls were plainly terrified and traumatized by what they had experienced. The disclosures continued, each time highlighting further the ritual element of the abuse. Quote, the children described being placed in coffins in graveyards, satanic rituals involving their father dressed in a frightening devil-like costume and other participants chanting around him, and a five-cornered star with a circle around it and an eye and heart symbol. They also expressed fear of being killed by the Blob, a friend of their mother's boyfriend. They described being forced to eat human flesh at the Blob's home and being forced by their mother and boyfriend to stick knives in persons being killed with the threat of being killed themselves. They went on to describe the mother, her boyfriend, and their father killing the Blob and his burial along with two other people in the backyard of their home in Hamilton, close quote. A full joint inquiry by CAS and police was launched to investigate the claims of Erica and Jenny. It failed to dig up the mass of bodies or bones which were described in the disclosures. This is common in cases throughout the world. Children are either unable to give sufficiently precise locations or are simply not believed. We shall see when we come to consider the handling of ritual abuse cases in Chapter 6, how that led to the abandoning of any criminal charges, a serious breakdown in the relationship between detectives and therapists, and in turn to an indirect or secondary mental abuse of the two children. But as the case dragged on, court-appointed psychiatrists warned that neither Erica nor Jenny should be allowed to testify in the custody hearings. The trauma of being exposed to what would have been an adversarial contest between competing barristers would be too damaging. The Honorable Judge Thomas Beckett agreed. To determine the case, he had heard all 61 adult witnesses, sat through the hours of audio and video evidence, and reviewed the 15,000 pages of transcripts. Almost as an aside, there were 142 exhibits listed over several thousand sheets of paper. On 30 March 1987, Beckett delivered his judgment. Erica and Jenny, together with their baby sister born during the hearing, were found to be in need of protection and were made wards of the Crown with no parental access. He found as fact that the two older girls had been sexually abused and that the baby would be at risk of abuse unless taken from her parents. On the question of ritual abuse, he steered a clever path. Whilst counsel for the parents had claimed that no abuse whatsoever had taken place, the police had argued that the CAS social worker had interfered and manipulated the children's evidence to include ritual abuse, an allegation to be echoed in Nottingham 2 years later. Beckett effectively dismissed the suggestion, saying that he accepted without qualification the social worker's evidence. He also found as fact that the children's real father had boasted of involvement with satanic friends. Nancy McGillivray and Nora Dugan reported, quote, but in what appeared to be a strategic move to avoid appeal of his decision, the judge did not make any findings of fact concerning the ritual abuse allegations. The compelling evidence of the sexual abuse of the children obviously assisted in this decision. This position was supported by the very term adopted early on in the trial for the ritual abuse allegations as florid, that is, ornate, an added frill to the principal reason for the abuse. Although clearly avoiding judicially ruling on the viability of the allegations, the judge did at some length consider the evidence tendered from the children's perspectives. He confirmed the defense argument that children, quote, do lie and fantasize, close quote, but in this case argued that the detail and the horror of the allegations belied the capability of a child emotionally or mentally to construct such evidence without an experiential base, close quote. The Honorable Judge Thomas Beckett went one stage further. He recognized judicially the maxims by which the therapists all over the world have to handle cases of ritual abuse. He argued that it was irrelevant, quote, whether the children actually saw murder, cannibalism, and cult activities, or whether they interpreted, thought, or believed their experience to be as they described, close quote. Beckett saw what other judges, and particularly law enforcement officers, have failed to see. So long as the children believe that they have experienced abuse, it is real for the purposes of therapy. And that in turn means that it has to be taken as seriously as any other disclosure. Perhaps by 1987, it was easier for Canadian professionals to listen to that evidence than for law enforcement officers, therapists, and judges in most other countries where children were disclosing identical details of ritual abuse. 7 years previously, Dr. Lawrence Pazder had published a book containing descriptions of therapy sessions with a young woman called Michelle Smith. Pazder was, in 1980, one of a 5-man psychiatric practice in Victoria, British Columbia. He had graduated with an MD from the University of Alberta in 1961, gained a diploma in topical medicine from Liverpool University the following year, and had been awarded a specialist certificate in psychiatry together with a diploma in psychiatric medicine by McGill University. In 1971, he had been made a fellow of Canada's Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons. During the 1970s, he variously practiced medicine in West Africa, took part in medical task forces, and served as chairman of the Mental Health Committee of the Health Planning Council of British Columbia. By the time he met Michelle Smith in the summer of 1976, he was in private practice and working as a psychiatrist within 2 hospitals in Victoria. In short, Lawrence Pazder was a respected member of the psychiatric establishment in British Columbia. Within 4 years, he would have recorded the first major clinical descriptions of satanic ritual abuse and traveled halfway across the world to the Vatican in search of someone to believe in them. In contrast to the lithe and tanned Lawrence Pazder, Michelle Smith was, at the age of 27, careworn and in mental turmoil. She was referred by Pasdur by her local GP. 6 weeks previously, she had miscarried and, despite every medical effort, continued to hemorrhage. Simultaneously, she was suffering from extreme, severe, and persistent grief, a grief too deep-seated to be explained even by the trauma of losing her baby. Michelle's childhood, from what she remembered, had been scarred by unhappiness. Her father had been a violent alcoholic, her mother withdrawn and undemonstrative. Even that might have been bearable, but when Michelle was 14, her mother died of cancer. She was sent by her grandparents to a Roman Catholic boarding school, even though she wasn't a Catholic and was therefore excluded from routine religious studies and worship. Within the year, all her grandparents died. As for her father, he never troubled to contact her again. Pasdur quickly recognized the signs of a lonely and unfulfilled childhood, but there was something more. Michelle gradually revealed the nature of nightmares she had gone through the week before their first consultation. She had dreamed that she had a maddening itch on her hand. When she scratched it, scores of tiny spiders streamed out of the skin. The nightmare Pasdur saw was symbolic, but of what? He agreed to work with Michelle, one appointment per week. Initially, the sessions seemed to go well. Pasdur was able to release some of the unhappy childhood memories Michelle had bottled up inside. But both suspected they had only touched the surface and that beneath these superficial problems lay a much deeper and far more severe mental disturbance. They began again, a new series of sessions. This time there was a tangible fear in Michelle as Pasdur gently took her mind back through childhood. So great was the fear that Pasdur asked Michelle's permission to tape record the therapy. She agreed. What followed was a unique archive recording for the first time her childhood memories of satanic ritual abuse. The therapy took place over several years. Each session disclosed a little more detail of precise rituals. From the start, Michelle's voice changed. It became at times that of a 5-year-old girl and a deep, guttural, semi-human snarl. Her body reacted too. Not merely did she shake and tremble when disclosing, but strangely shaped rashes appeared on her skin. As Michelle Smith's sessions with Lawrence Pasdur between 1976 and 1978 formed the first clinical recording of what came to be known as ritual abuse, it is worth listing some of her recollections to note how closely they resemble those of very young children around the world. And it says, for a full count, see Michelle Remembers by Smith and Pasdur. Simon & Schuster, 1980. The abuse took place in 1954 and 1955 when Michelle was about 5. It involved multiple perpetrators, men and women, who wore a variety of robes, chanted, and danced in a room lit by candles. The events from one of the earliest reminiscences during the therapy set the pattern for what was to follow. Quote, some women had entered the darkened space. One woman pushed the bed to the side of a room, another moved a bureau. Some of them went about tacking up large black sheets on all 4 walls. Then the women began to set up candles, perhaps 20 or 30 in all. Someone draped the bureau with a round black cloth embroidered in an intricate white design. On top of the cloth were placed 2 silver goblets and a knife. Michelle was screaming, "Help, help, help! They were putting this stuff in my eyes and my ears and my nose." Several of them fetched a handful of colorful sticks, dark red and brown, muddy yellow, dirty green, purple, and black. They handed them to a woman in a cape. She studied the arrangement of the sticks, selected one of them, dipped it in a silver goblet, and inserted it in Michelle's rectum. Michelle was lifted and placed on the bureau inside a semicircle of candles. Michelle noticed that the room now also contained men, along with the women who had been there all along. They too were in dark clothing. Everyone was chanting as if in a strange ancient language. Close quote. Subsequent sessions revealed buried memories of being imprisoned in cages, cut with knives, painted like a clown, buried in ancient graves, the killing of small babies, and the enforced consumption of urine, feces, and human flesh. Throughout the therapy, the intensity of recollections left both Pazder and Michel quite literally exhausted. In his career, Pazder had worked extensively in Africa and studied some of the more gruesome folk religions. Much that Michel remembered in their sessions reminded him of similar African rituals. Yet there was a difference, too. Some of the acts seemed specifically aimed at defiling Christianity or Christian symbols. Quote, Michel was put to bed at sundown and awakened in the middle of the night. The sleepy child saw a nurse's cloak spread on the floor. On the cloak was a bedpan. The nurse gave Michel an enema, and when the child could wait no longer, the nurse led her over, forced her to squat down, and then yanked away the bedpan and flipped aside part of the cloak. The child found herself helplessly defecating on the floor. But on the floor where the cloak and the bedhead had been were a crucifix and a Bible. When Michel saw she had sold them, she was horrified. Close quote. Through the ensuing weeks and months, the recollections became clearer that Pazder became more convinced. He was confronting memories not simply of an extreme and bizarre abuse, but of a highly organized ritual which seemed to have the worship of Satan as its goal. Unprompted, Michel dredged up memories of inverted crosses, ram's horns, modeled on the familiar satanic image of the goat of Mendes, and ritual chanting. Safe with Pazder, she was reliving experiences which were clearly satanic and which would be matched by other survivors' testimonies all over the world in the following decade. Quote, they lit a big fire in the corner. Next to the fire, they assembled a whole collection of crosses, paper ones, wooden ones, crosses made of dead holly. Some they ripped apart, some they chopped up. They threw all of them into the fire. Michel saw they had another dead baby, and she cried out for them to stop, but they didn't listen. They nailed its little hands and feet to a big wooden cross that they had saved from the fire, and then they broke all the bones in the body. Now they were draping everything in black. They were wearing their black robes again, and their faces were painted white. The candles were red. They are putting me upside down, Michel recalled. I'm upside down. Why am I upside down? I don't want to be here. I'm going to die. What if I hang here for about a year? No one will know I exist, and the spiders will eat me up. Close quote. Pazder knew by the end that his patient was not fabricating or fantasizing the recollections. There was simply too much detail, too deeply felt. It hurt Michel to disclose it, even at the distance of more than 20 years. And then there were the rashes. When she was talking about seeing Satan with his tail lashing her, the rash on her neck assumed the unmistakable traditional image of the devil's spade tail. When she remembered being entwined with or abused by snakes, the rashes on her arms resembled burns made by a long, sinuous rope. Doubtless the rashes were created by her body rather than by any external supernatural force. But what memories caused her body to create those precise shapes? Pazder was convinced that he knew. Unthinkable as it was, he believed that there was no other explanation. Michelle Smith was telling the truth. San Francisco, February 1987. Kelly was frightened. She had been hurt by the men and women who did bad things to her, but they made her promise not to tell. Now the kind lady in front of her was saying it would be okay. She could say what had happened. Kelly was 3.5 years old. It was a big decision for a little girl who felt very alone. This time she wouldn't say anything, but if the kind lady kept asking, the kind lady did keep asking, gently. At her 4th therapy session, Kelly spilled out what she had held inside for more than 6 months and felt a bit better. What Kelly told her therapist was, by 1987, less of a shock than it might have been. She said she had been taken as usual by her father to the daycare center at the U.S. Army Presidio base in San Francisco. Sometimes bad men and women had touched her bottom there. Sometimes she had been taken off the base and abused. In particular, she remembered being taken to a house with a black room with a cross painted on the ceiling. Men and women wearing robes had abused her. One man had pushed his penis into her anus, vagina, and mouth. Others had taken photographs. The investigators added the case to their files. More than 58 very young children had been abused at the Presidio base, and many were independently disclosing details of what could only have been rituals: cloaks, candles, knives, the eating of feces and drinking of urine, the murder of babies. The Presidio Daycare Center had been closed for several months by the time Kelly finally disclosed the details of her abuse. Across the city and throughout the surrounding areas of California, young children who no longer had any contact with each other repeated the same allegations to their parents. The story told to the mother, Debbie, was typical. Quote, "My boys told me that they had gone to the daycare center, where several adults molested them in rituals. The adults wore robes and chanted. There were candles, and the kids said they were made to eat human excrement and drink urine and blood. All the children had to have sex with each other or try to, as well as be abused by the adults. One man in particular, who the boys were able to identify, had oral sex with them and he sodomized them. This didn't just happen at the Presidio Daycare Center. The boys said they were taken to other places off the base. The details they gave were very clear. They had a whole load of information about what they'd been through, which they gave to the detectives," close quote. We shall see in chapter 5 what happened to that information and what became of the man Debbie's sons identified as their abuser. But the Presidio case was the latest in a long line of, generally inconclusive, American ritual abuse investigations. By 1984, law enforcement specialists like Sandy Gallant had been able to confirm genuine cases of minor satanic crime, typically desecration of or theft from churches, in every state of the Union. More worrying were the scores of cases of suicide or murder stretched across 24 states, which allegedly involved satanic ritual. At the time of the Presidio investigation, detectives throughout America were investigating cases of multiple perpetrator ritual abuse. In each, the independent disclosures from very young children contained the same bizarre ingredients. Army families at West Point, New York, were assisting in an investigation into satanic ritual abuse at the military daycare center during 1983 and 1984. One victim told her mother she had been, quote, "involved in a satanic workshop where there was a marriage to the devil and a dog's tail and paw was cut and burnt in front of her," close quote. From 1983 to 1985, children attending the McMartin preschool in the attractive Los Angeles resort of Manhattan Beach claimed that they had been forced to take part in rituals involving black-robed adults who chanted and killed animals on an altar. Some said that they were made to drink blood. Also in 1985, 19 children in Bakersfield, California, reported abuse by a group of 77 adults who had performed animal sacrifice, blood drinking ceremonies, and church services with prayers to the devil. Simultaneously, law enforcement officials in Illinois, Miami, El Paso, Omaha, Carson City, and Sacramento were hearing almost identical testimony, primarily from preschool-aged children. The Miami case was all too typical. The investigation began when a 4-year-old boy emerged from the bathroom at his family home and calmly asked his mother to kiss his penis. When pressed to explain this request, he said that Ileana had kissed his penis. Wasn't that okay? Ileana Fuster was 18 years old and the apparently demure wife of an interior design property investor. In addition to these business interests, Frank and Ileana Fuster ran a daycare center from their home in the fashionable Country Walk neighborhood. 24 children were cared for each day by the Fusters. More than 12 of those children, all aged between 3 and 6, appeared to have been abused. 8 eventually testified against the Fusters. The stories they told, independently, matched not only each other's, but the national pattern. The children had been forced to drink an unpleasant drug-laced liquid and to play games involving feces and urine. Frank and Ileana had dressed up in frightening masks. Sometimes Frank had videotaped the rituals. At other times, he had held knives at the children's throats and warned them not to disclose what had happened. Animals had played a part in the rituals. The children disclosed seeing them killed or raped to pieces during the abuse. For once, detectives knew that the children were not fantasizing these apparently incredible allegations. Ileana Fuster broke down during the trial. She admitted the rituals and testified against her husband. A small victory had been won. Sussex, January 1988. Kitty thought she was going quite mad. Her teenage daughter had arrived unexpectedly just before Christmas, tense, mute, and unwilling to explain. When she did, Kitty could barely understand what she was saying, let alone work out what was to be done. Natalie had been born 13 years before, the last gamble Kitty and her husband had taken to shore up their dying marriage. It hadn't worked, and Kitty, convent girl born and bred, took off to Europe in search of adventure. Natalie stayed behind with her father. At first, they stayed on in the house that she had been born into. Then, when Natalie was 4, they moved in with her father's widowed mother. It was a comfortably sized house in southeast London. There was enough room for 3 of them, except that Natalie could never get far enough away from her nun. Quote, right from that day, as far back as I can remember, I had men and women touching me. Nan, my uncles, strangers, they all touched me and raped me, I supposed. It became part of my life, close quote. After a few months, Natalie's father moved out of the house, leaving her in the care of her nun. He knew nothing about the abuse his daughter was being put through, much less what was to follow. From that point on, the abuse took on a very different complexion. Natalie was made to attend parties, both in her nan's house and elsewhere, where large numbers of adult men and women abused equally large numbers of children. Quote, we used to go to the one particular big house in the country, and the rituals took place in the basement. The walls were sort of plain color, but there were symbols on them. At one end of the room, there was a big star with 5 points inside a circle. There was a goat's head. I can't remember whether it was in the star or just below, and there were smaller, similar symbols around the room. There was another star on the floor in a circle. Us kids were made to lie in it at times. Below the big star on the wall, there was a couple of boxes covered with cloth, which had a candle at either end. I didn't know the word then, but I suppose now that's what you'd call an altar. The lady who was in charge stood in front of the altar. The other people used to come into the room in black robes with hoods. They were chanting, and then they would walk around the circle. Sometimes the lady in charge, and sometimes my nan, used to read words out of a thick black book. It was like a big old Bible, but I couldn't understand the words. At first, when I went to this house, I wasn't really made to do anything, just to sit and watch. But after a while, I was told to touch the other kids, sexually. Then the same with the grown-up people, close quote. As Natalie started to disclose these early memories of rituals, Kitty suspected there was something else beneath the surface, something Natalie was holding back. Quote, she was in a very distressed state to begin with. First, she told me just about the abuse, even though that was by quite a few people. But then I started getting hints of something more, and I started asking questions about who was where at what point. In the finish, she said to me that all this had been done in some sort of rite in the name of Lucifer. After that, it got even more painful, close quote. There were many times after that day in January that Kitty wished she had never pressed on with questions. What she heard, alone and with no prior experience of ritual abuse or Satanism, scarred her life and left her racked with guilt forever abandoning her daughter. Quote, she's told me of bestial acts with many children being abused in orgy-type rituals. There were sacrifices of animals and people, children mainly, to Lucifer. The rituals involved the eating and drinking of human excrement, drinking blood, and eating flesh after the person had been sacrificed. All this was done in Lucifer's name. It was obviously an ordeal for Natalie to have to tell me this. She was going through hell as she remembered each bit, and she used to sort of test me out to see if I was going to be able to stomach what she was about to say. I knew, though, that she needed to give off all of this, to get rid of it somehow by telling me. There were times when it got too much. I can't remember a big chunk of one night when she told me about a particular ritual. I came to underneath a rose bush in the garden. I was trembling and sick. My spirit just caved in that night. If it was like that for me, sitting there listening, what was it like for Natalie to go through? Close quote. The disclosures that so affected Kitty, recalling a series of events that continued to haunt Natalie during the day and in nightmares that would terrify her mother by their intensity. Quote, I don't know how many people there were in the room, but some of them sounded posh, not common like me and my family. I could pick out accents, Scottish, American, and there were Black and Chinese people there too. Some of the children were in cages. That's how they were kept if they were going to be sacrificed. The lady would read out of a book and there would be chanting, and then the kid would be killed in the circle or on the altar. Then there would be an orgy with everyone having sex with each other and the rest of the kids. I was, well, raped by just about anybody who was there, my uncles, even my nan. They even used to do it with animals. After that, some more words were read from the book and it was over. Then everyone just left the room like nothing had happened. If this happened at a weekend, it would last for a couple of hours. But if it was during the week, it would go on longer. Sometimes it seemed like it went on all day. Close quote. The persistent sexual abuse of Natalie was not limited to the satanic rituals. Throughout the years she lived with her grandmother, she was systematically prostituted. Strange men would come to the house and pay to have sex with her. Simultaneously, her uncles would abuse her. She was beaten if she tried to resist. By the time she reached puberty, Natalie was encased in a miserable and suffocating web of evil. But the beginnings of sexual maturity brought a new abuse. Quote, Natalie was made pregnant, we think during one of the rituals. They allowed the baby to grow a little, just for a few months. Then she was used in a special ceremony. The men and women in cloaks, she thinks there were about 13 of them, took her to the room one night and showed her a table. There was a cloth on it, not the usual altar cloth, though, and it had been arranged with place settings for a meal with silver cups. They pushed up one end of the cloth and laid her up on that bit of the table. She knew she was pregnant by this time, and so did they. With everyone there watching, her nan aborted her. The child was born just about alive, so it can't have been that little. Natalie says she can remember looking into the baby's eyes. Some people would call it a fetus, but I can't. And she's sure it held her gaze for a second. Then they took it and it sort of tried to cry, and she said she screamed, but they took it and carved it like a roast. Then they ate its flesh and drank some of its blood in the chalices. At some point they were mocking Natalie, saying, did you like its father then? And after that they made her swallow some of it. Close quote. It wasn't easy for Natalie to tell her mother this part. She led up to this disclosure piece by piece, constantly testing her mother to see whether she could cope with the terrible detail. In part, this was self-protection. Natalie knew she had taken part in a litany of criminal offenses so serious that she feared the police almost as much as she was terrified of her Nan. That she had been an unwilling accomplice seemed not to matter. She felt dirty, worthless, and above all, guilty. Kitty knew she would have to involve the law. Natalie had run away, escaped from her legal guardian, and for all she knew, police were already looking for her. Above all, the disclosures were so serious, and the number of victims and perpetrators apparently so great that Kitty felt she had no choice. With the biggest disclosure out of the way, Natalie now began to fill in the details. Her recollections were at times hazy, the result, she said, of repeated drugging. Quote, whenever I was taken to the big house in the country, I used to be drugged by my Nan. The drugs made me feel as though I wasn't really there. When the rituals started, the drugs hadn't worn off, and although I knew what was happening to me, I couldn't fight back or anything. I just didn't seem to be there. I couldn't control my body or run away or anything. I felt like I was floating. But I can remember some things about the house. There was a courtyard sort of inside the building, but in the open air. There were cages there, and children were put in them, sometimes for being naughty, sometimes just to be kept there. People used to get killed in the courtyard as well. Some of them were hung and then cut up so that their insides came out. Others were pushed underwater and drowned, although I think this was a punishment for doing something wrong. Downstairs in the basement, there were ovens, sort of like potter's kilns. Some children were burned in there alive as a punishment, but mostly they were used to burn away the bodies. The circle with the star in it was special. All the grown-up people stepped around it chanting in a funny sort of language, and they treated the lines of the circle like they were red-hot coals or something. They said that if anyone went inside them when they shouldn't, something really bad would happen. Sometimes I would be tied to a sort of post in the middle of the circle and star on the floor. The people came and screamed at me and spat at me and pissed on me. I don't know what that was for. The lady who was in charge used to wear a mask and said everything like we were in church, sort of hushed. I didn't understand much about it, but I did know who they were doing this for. It was for Lucifer. They used to talk about Lucifer all the time, and during the ceremonies, he used to appear and sort of be there. They used to say that all this was for him. I thought he was just a normal person, just another person who was there, close quote. Kitty herself was sure of one thing. Natalie was utterly sincere. She believed every word of what she said and seemed desperate for her mother to do the same. Quote, did I believe her? Yes. You could see the terror coming into her eyes when she talked about it, even when she just thought about it. Pure terror all over her little face. It might have been too much for me to take in all at once, but it was too much for her to have made it up. She couldn't have done. She was actually there, and she did see what she said she saw, close quote. Aside from medical evidence which tended to corroborate her testimony, one aspect of Natalie's disclosure made it more likely that her experience was genuine. Until the point at which we met and talked, she had clearly considered that the idea Lucifer might not have been real, that he might have been either a drug-induced hallucination or an adult man dressed up. To her, he was a part of her normal daily life. Quote, he was sort of a friend, or at least he seemed to be then. He used to speak to me, and I wanted him to because I never really had any friends. At school, they used to say I was weird and different. So when I was locked up in my room at Nan's, he used to be there, to play with. I had loads of toys, but no friends to play with, except him. I know now he was a spirit or something, an evil one. But they were all evil, weren't they? Close quote.